The Trijicon Credo is nothing new to my channel. In fact, this one makes the fourth one total, which is a lot. They're offering a lot of different magnifications and configurations. They also don't cost a whole lot. This 3x9 comes in at around $550, but I'm sure you could find it for cheaper than that. And they're all made in Japan. So for the price, you get something that's Japanese made by a good reputable company with a pretty good warranty, and usually comes with a pretty decent amount of features. The boxes they come in are also really, really nice, made out of very dense, thick cardboard. They're illustrated extremely well, and the foam always fits beautifully. But you're not here to ooh and ah about how well the foam fits around the scope. No. In fact, I'm sure you'd much rather hear about what it's like to have one of these in hand and how the controls all feel. So, without further ado, let's get started. If you're unfamiliar with the Trijicon Credo, just know that it's like every other Trijicon Credo, or AccuPower. Not the AccuPoint. The AccuPoints are tritium based. The AccuPowers were battery powered, and the Credos and the Ascents basically replace the AccuPowers, so keep that in mind. Before we quickly take a look at the overall controls, let's weigh this thing. On their website, Trijicon claims it comes in at about 17 ounces, and indeed, it does, 17.3. One thing I did not mention yet is that this one has an extended throw lever on the magnification ring, so that could be an extra 0.2 of an ounce or so. Plus my scale's not calibrated, so plus or minus 10% I'm very happy with. At the time of filming this, the only other scope that I had to really show you a weight comparison is my Gen 1 PST 2.5 to 10 by 32 inverse focal plane from Vortex. As you can see, it comes in just a little bit heavier. From there, let's take a quick look at the fast focus eyepiece. Just like every other Trijicon product, it's got a lot of resistance on it, which means that it takes a lot of effort to turn, which is a good thing. And when we pull it all the way out and put it in a quarter turn, it is rock solid. Very nice to see. The magnification ring already comes with that little thumb ramp, which is also very nice. And another nice thing is it's not 180 degrees from minimum to maximum. It's a little bit shorter than that. Rotating it requires a good amount of resistance and feels very smooth and easy to turn in hand. Honestly, you don't really need this throw lever on it, but the owner insisted on me putting it on there for him, so I figured why the hell not. I will say that for this throw lever, if you're curious to get one, it slips on there extremely tight. So you gotta be careful not to damage any of the finishes when you slip that thing on there. From there, taking a look at the battery compartment, I really like that Trijicon has the battery cap recessed in the actual dial. What this means is you aren't going to accidentally turn off the battery compartment, or rather unscrew the battery compartment, and then lose contact with the battery, or even worse, break the seal that's preventing all the water and contaminants from getting inside and frying the board. So double A thumbs up for you, Trijicon, for doing that, because so many manufacturers would much rather have a cap that's the exact same outside diameter and splines or whatever sort of texturing that they're putting on that illumination control, so when you go to turn it one too many times, you could accidentally screw it off and cause damage. As for the illumination control itself, I'm switching back to the audio from the video, so this way you can get a much better sense of how good it is. Moving on to the illumination control, you can clearly see we have 11 brightness settings with offs in between. There's a little bit of slop in the detent, but a very positive click, both in feel and sound, every time we adjust it. Beautiful. It actually feels like a pretty high-end elevation or windage turret. That's how good that thing sounds and feels. The turrets are the last thing that we're going to take a look at before we get behind this thing. And no surprise there, they are standard Trijicon across the board. They have a really good sound, a really good feel, and are toolless resettable to 0. And because they're capped, you don't have to worry about losing or bumping out your 0 by brushing up against something when you're out in the field. And because this is a 3x9, having capped turrets on a more or less hunting setup makes just a whole lot of sense to me. So, with that, without further ado, let's get behind this thing and see if it's worth its $550 price tag. The illuminated mil-square reticle on this thing is unlike anything I've ever seen before. That's actually a blatant lie. The mil-quad reticle that we will find in a lot of SWFA's products is basically the exact same thing, with the exception of the mil-quad is better. not just with the shape of the 1 mil increments on the milling part of the reticle itself, but the posts here at 3, 6, 9, and 12 are very small and short. No idea why. The mill quad has giant posts at 9, 12, and 3 and really help draw my eye right smack dab to the center, which is what you want. Because this is second focal plane, when you adjust the magnification, the reticle will not change sizes, which means that if you want that milling reticle to actually be a milling reticle, you got to set yourself at a particular magnification. As far as the illumination, it is quite good. I'm not going to say it's great, but I'm not going to say it's bad. It's good. Trijicon typically does a pretty good job with their illumination, so I'm very happy to see that this one is no different. Again, the turrets are a typical Trijicon. They're more than fine. They might not line up perfectly to the hash mark, but they sound good, they feel good, they reset to 0, and they're capped. I should also mention, this is a 1-inch main body tube as opposed to 30mm, which I find has become the norm recently. If you're having a hard time trying to figure out what a milling reticle will look like in second focal plane, at 9x you can clearly see it lines up with the target, but as we go down in the magnification, the scaling does not change, it remains the same. Happily, however, at 9x, which is the maximum for the scope, clearly, the reticle does line up to my target perfectly. Despite the fact that the turret setup on this is for set and forget, I am still curious to see how well it's going to track. So, because this is a mil scope and I have a mil target, I can easily do this. And across 4 mils up and over, we are about 1/10 of a mil off on the elevation. Windage, however, resets perfectly to 0, and we continue up until we run out of travel in the erector. That is one of the main issues with going with a 1-inch tube. You aren't going to have anywhere near as much adjustment in your erector setup, whether it's windage or elevation, to possibly dial out at distance. So a second focal plane 1-inch scope like this is perfectly fine. Happily, though, there is almost no virtual slop in the elevation or windage erectors, so at least you know that when you make an adjustment, it should be true to form when you actually do it on the range. But keep in mind, this is still a serving size of 1, so what I experience might not be the same as what you experience, unfortunately. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a hunting scope first and foremost, so don't think that this is anything other than what it is, which is a hunting scope. This is designed to be as simple and as lightweight as possible, and at 17 ounces, it does that very well. Capped turrets mean that you don't have to worry about this thing getting bumped off whenever you're traveling through the bush. Once this thing is bolted down and 0, the only thing you got to worry about is your magnification and your illumination. Illumination is really nice to have on a hunting scope because if you're in thick brush and you lose this very thin reticle, it's nice to hopefully have it pop out and create contrast. Because this does not have a side focus, one potential problem you might run into if you're trying to shoot at something really close, like this 30-yard power transformer at higher magnification, it's not going to be overly sharp, primarily because it's set at least 100-yard parallax. I could not find out exactly what Trijicon had spec'd this to, but I'm assuming it's about 100 yards or 100 meters, whichever one you want to prefer. Illumination here is daytime visible, so at nighttime when you're actually going to need it, or at dusk, twilight, especially if you're in the woods, it should create more than enough contrast between the reticle and whatever potential target and or obstacles that you have in the way as needed. Happily, however, once we look past that 30-yard target and onto something with a little bit more distance on it, like this 400-yard brick building, you can see that from minimum to maximum magnification here at 9x, the image is surprisingly good. Even that tree line at the far left, which is around 250 yards, and the tree lines behind the building at about 600 or 700 yards, all look really good. But this is a serving size of 1. You might have one where maybe the parallax is set a little bit off, maybe it's a little bit farther, maybe it's a little bit closer, and it might not look as good. I will, however, say that this is much better than the Credo 2-10 that I reviewed many, many moons ago, because at 10x, that thing was really ugly and nasty. At least here at 9x, everything looks quite good. But this is not the whole story. This is only a very small target. If you wanted to engage at farther out, or maybe you just want to spot for somebody else, if you wanted to look out at 900 yards, let's say on this power tower, you can also see that at that distance, everything seems to be pretty sharp as well. As far as color representation, I found that this scope was pretty good. I have seen better, I have seen worse. I think for the $550 or so that this comes in at, I think it's more than adequate. For anyone wondering what the performance of the glass would be like at a slightly closer distance, maybe you are interested in shooting this thing at 50 yards to 100 yards. As far as that, we're going to get there. At 3x panning across the targets here at 50 yards, there's no noticeable shift. There's no noticeable fisheye. It's very flat, and it's pretty good, as it should be because it's a 3x. However, increasing the magnification here to full, the center of the image looks pretty good, but the outside edge just falls apart. Again, this is set up for probably about 100-yard parallax and out, so anything inside that is not going to be ideal. If you were worrying about shooting at closer targets, I'd probably recommend like a 2 to 7 if you wanted to stay in the very simple realm, but the 3 to 9 here just doesn't work out that well. As far as the Eyebox, this thing has a pretty forgiving 3x. And this is not the first time we've seen a 3x perform this good. Just recently, the SWFA HD 3-9 had a very similar 3x performance where it literally is just as big as you could possibly get, but because this has illumination, it's a lot easier to find your way back to the center when you're off in the shadows. And because this is second focal plane, you can see the illumination off into the shadows, unlike with first focal plane scopes. That is one of the main reasons why I would choose a second focal plane LPVO, let's say, over first focal plane LPVO, especially if you plan on shooting it in a fairly dynamic environment, not just off a bench all day long. At 9x, there's no surprise there. The Eyebox does get pretty tight, but it's still pretty usable, especially since with the illumination, if you need to use it and you need to get behind it in a hurry, the illumination will help at least guide your eye to the center. However, I still wish they chose a better friggin' reticle because this one just, it seems so thin and gets lost so easily. If you are planning on taking this thing hunting, low light performance is going to matter to you. At 3x, the sky does have a slight change in the color temperature. You can see it's a lot more blue looking through the scope as it is off to the side, but it's still not that far off. I'd say within a couple of percent. Illumination is fantastic and basically visible all the way to like the bottom 5, which is basically what this thing is calibrated for. I really don't think you'd have to jump around trying to figure out what sort of illumination setting would be best for you. Magnification is usually what kills a scope's light transmission, and as we crest above 6x, it does start to get a little bit darker, but more importantly than darkness, it is the ability to get behind it easily. In daylight, the 9x is pretty easy to get behind, but at night, it's extremely challenging. So if you do plan on using this thing in lower light environments more frequently, I would 100% recommend trying to find something with a larger front objective that would work for you. 50 or 56mm would make a huge difference here. Let's do some side-by-side comparisons, and we're going to start with the SWFA HD 3-9. I just did the SWFA 3-9, and I figured why not put two 3x9s back to back? This way, maybe if you're curious about one, you could figure out which one would be best for you. Here at both of these being at 3x, the Credo does have a larger view looking through it, but that all changes once we start increasing the magnification on the SWFA. There is some tunneling, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but the overall image and sharpness, colors, and clarity, I absolutely have to give to the SWFA. Now, there are a couple of key differences between these two, but they're all rather small. In fact, it's just the small parts that add up to become something large. At 30 yards, these both suck at maximum magnification, but at 400 yards or even 100 yards and looking out, that is when you're going to start noticing the biggest difference. Between the Credo and the SWFAs do not come illuminated, so the Credo wins hands down with the illumination if that's what you're interested in. As far as field of view, they're both about the same. I might give the edge ever so slightly to the SWFA, but I hate the tunneling. You also need to buy a throw lever for the SWFA. You do not need to do that for the Credo. Both of these are made in Japan, just so you know. So if you're worried about that, you shouldn't be because they're basically the same. As far as the turrets, the SWFA has non-locking, non-zero resetting exposed target turrets on both the windage and the elevation. But 3-9s are supposed to be hunting scopes, right? See? Not all the time. The SWFA, I feel they're trying to do something a bit in between. Now, with the SWFA image here, you are going to notice a little bit more mirage because that was filmed in the dead of winter. The Credo was filmed in the beginning of the spring, so the air temperature is going to play a huge role. But I still have to give the colors and contrast to the SWFA. The Credo does perform quite well, but I think the image absolutely has to go to the SWFA. But again, that's just my personal opinion and from what I was able to gather with these two scopes independently. As far as the weight, the SWFA on paper is about 2 ounces lighter, but on my scale it's about 3 ounces lighter, which is a pretty significant weight loss, or rather weight gain. And price is near, as makes no difference, about the same. It's about a $50 difference between the two, the Credo being cheaper. This is going to come down to 100% personal preference and what you're looking for between these two. Mirroring what I said during the SWFA review, if you want something with a little more tactical abilities, go with the SWFA. If you want something that is a little bit lighter and a little bit easier to set up and use, go with the Credo. If you want something that needs illumination, go with the Credo. Or you can go with neither of these and go with something else that I think sort of replaces the 3x9. Something like the 2-10 or 2-12. More specifically, the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2-12. I absolutely love and adore the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2, and at first glance, the 2x on the right versus the 3x on the left is a pretty sizable difference. Even more so when we start increasing the magnification and realize that, at least with the Helos, we can adjust the side focus to get the image to look really good. Now, it must be said, the Helos has good glass, but not great glass. But this is also a Chinese-made scope, but it does come in at about the same price point as the Credo. In fact, a little bit less. Typically, you can find them in the high 4s to low 5s, so as near as makes no difference within spitting distance. Beyond the price point, however, there are a lot of key differences. The first off being the 2x at the low end for the Helos, 3x for the Credo, which here at 400 yards gives you a much better sense of just how drastically different the two of them are. And in my opinion, it gives a much better sense of situational awareness when you're behind the scope. And of course, the magnification range. But everything about the Helos is set up for more tactical use. It's got exposed but locking with very good locking turrets. It's got a side focus. It's got a much larger magnification range. In fact, more than twice the magnification range, because going from a 3x multiplier to a 6x is, guess what? Twice the magnification range. But it's also got a 30mm tube, allows for a much more adjustability, and it's just, in my opinion, a better overall scope for most everything, with the exception of weight. This Athlon comes in at about 25 ounces, so 8 ounces heavier than the Credo. That is going to be the biggest thing to take away between these two, is the weight. If you can deal with the weight and you want a tactical scope that could also work as a hunting scope, the Helos is the one to get for me. If you absolutely need to go lighter weight and you're between these two, let's say, you got to go with the Credo, because that's a lot of weight and no one can argue against that. 8 ounces, that's a mount and then some. That's not a little bit of weight. But the Helos is really good. It doesn't feel like a Chinese-made scope. It's held up really well for me in my findings. Again, a serving size of 1. But I have almost 1,000 rounds through it on my Ruger. The Credo I've had no real experience with. But I prefer everything else about the Helos. Even the extra weight, I don't mind. I'd much rather have that and have a scope that has a much larger envelope of capacity as opposed to just this Credo. Again, however, this isn't a scope for me, this is a scope for you, so ultimately only you can answer the question of which scope would be best for you. To throw another wrench in the machine, here is the Swampfox Arrowhead 1-10 in second focal plane. Why am I comparing this to the Credo? It's actually a little bit closer than you might think, ladies and gentlemen. The only real difference between these two, other than their magnification range, the Credo being a 3-9, the Arrowhead being a 1-10, is, well, that's basically it. There's only about a 3-ounce difference between these two. Yes, the Arrowhead is made in China, but they're both in second focal plane. They both have a fixed side focus or parallax. The Arrowhead now does have exposed but locking turrets, and they both have illumination. And I had to actually say that the Arrowhead has better illumination than the Credo. I also prefer the Arrowhead reticle more, and guess what? You can get a bunch of different reticles for the Arrowhead. You can get a bunch of different reticles for the Credo as well, but I still think I prefer the Arrowhead. Not only do I prefer the reticles and the setup with the Arrowhead, but also the view looking through it is much nicer. It's larger, and it really fills out the eye a lot better. The 1x on the Arrowhead is also really, really good for a 1x on a 1 to 10 LPVO like this. And the 10x is pretty good. I will say that the Credo edges it out a little bit at the maximum magnification, but with the Arrowhead I did film that on a very cloudy day. The Credo is also cloudy, but not as cloudy as with the Arrowhead. So again, you gotta pick and choose what's going to be a little bit better for you. But I would still probably pick the Arrowhead against these two. It's got so much more capacity. You could use it as a set and forget scope by just zeroing out your turrets, locking them and never unlocking them. But if you want to dial out for distance, guess what? You have that option. You have a 9x and a 10x on the maximum. That's pretty close, so that's basically a wash. But going from a 1x to a 3x is monstrous. Now again, it's about 3 ounces heavier, and it is made in China, but it's also about $100 plus less expensive. Now, I'm not saying that the Arrowhead is the only other option or something that I would recommend over the Credo. Again, it's up to what you are going to want out of a scope. For me, though, I'd probably pick the Arrowhead between these two in particular because it's not that much heavier, it's less expensive, it's got pretty damn good glass on it. I remember it tracking pretty good, and I really enjoyed using it. The only reason why I sold it was because I really didn't have an overall purpose for it. But you can bet your bottom dollar if I wanted to just keep it on a budget sort of hunting rig, that would have probably been the one I would have left on it. Despite the fact it's a little bit heavier than most, just the overall capacity of it was pretty damn good. In fact, I do kind of regret selling it because I did enjoy using that for what it's worth. And with that, that's going to bring me into my final thoughts. The Trijicon Credo 3x9 is a 3x9. It's pretty good in most situations. It's set up properly as a hunting scope, but I would go with a slightly different reticle, something that would be a little bit easier for my eye to pick up at any magnification range. The Illumination is pretty good. It's nice and lightweight. It's got a good overall sense of feel, fit, and finish. All the controls are solid. And it's a Trijicon product. So God forbid there is a problem, Trijicon should be able to take care of you without much issue. But is the 3 to 9 an amazing magnification range? I think I want to save that for another video. I think I'm gonna ask that question and try to find that out as a whole sort of ensemble. But for right now, with this scope, I think it works pretty good. The 3x is good. The 9x is good. Illumination is good. The controls are good to great. It's lightweight. It's not that expensive for a Japanese-made optic of any sort. And if good enough is good enough for you, then this might be a good enough optic for you. So, with that all being said, a huge thank you to the individual that sent this in for review. I'm very happy to always get my hands on something that I normally wouldn't buy because I personally don't think that a 3 to 9 is really valuable anymore. It used to be back in the day when that was like the only variable powered scope that you'd get back in like the 60s, but this ain't the 60s, my friend. And with that, thank you all very much for watching. It's because of all of you, with your likes, your shares, your subscribes, your comments, that I keep this channel going. So thank you all very much. And as always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.